Okay, so when you're drawing fabric, one of the things that you first want to do is actually draw the fabric itself. Fabric is made up of a lot of different folds and shapes that overlap each other, fall into shadows. So once you get your basic outline drawn, first thing that you want to do is establish where your shadows are. Those are anchor points for the drawing. It will create a very nice contrast that you can work with. You don't want to do it too dark. You're just establishing lightly where these shadows fall. Now this is going to also be a fairly dark piece of fabric that I'm working from. So this is more to show you how to work with dark fabrics as opposed to, say, a white or an off-white fabric. So I'm just finding out where those darkest shadows are, and I'm putting those down very lightly. Remember to use the side of your pencil as much as you can to get those areas covered. Okay. Once I've got the basic shadow shapes put in, the next thing that you want to determine is how dark those are going to be, and since I'm working with a dark colored fabric, how I'm going to have to render the fabric and the shadows together so that they maintain their difference but look as though they're the same piece of cloth and not just abstract geometric shapes. I have to allow for all of the twists and turns of the fabric. I have to determine all of these folds and how they're going to react to each other and how best to render them. So what I do is I generally pick a focal point that is an area of importance in the drawing, and I'll start working out from that area first, and I'm using a medium pencil. So all I'm doing is adding an extra layer of dark to this to start with in just the areas. These are the areas. What I'm doing right now is I'm rendering the areas that are going to be the blackest blacks, but I'm gradually finding my way there. Okay, I am not sitting there and scribbling in all of these black areas. I'm gradually building it up because these areas here that are folds, they still are continuing into the fabric. Just because they stop at the shadows doesn't mean they stop existing. Remember, shadows are just basically the absence of light. So if you're drawing something that recedes into the shadows, it's still going to be there. So you want to make sure that you render it in such a way that it's not going to just disappear. Or at least stop and become sort of like a two-dimensional flat object. You want it to have dimension, or as much dimension as you can allow for. Once I've got these very dark shapes put in, at least in their first stage, I'm going to gradually create a gradation from that very dark into areas that are dark but not as dark. Okay, so I'm putting an edge on it. If I have to, I'll go back in, reestablish those shapes. But remember, this object continues along. The fold goes underneath. Okay, so I'm creating a gradation here. But making sure that the darkest shadow shape retains the darkest values so that there's no confusing what I'm supposed to be rendering. One of the hardest parts about rendering fabric is getting lost in what is dark, what isn't, because the fabrics, the shadows, the overlapping, the circular loops that occur when fabric is folded over on itself can be very confusing. So you want to keep it very, very simple and maintain its original shape so that you don't get lost. Remember, you're attempting to render fabric that has dimension, 3 dimensions. Okay, so it has to have a light area, a mid-tone area, and a dark area. And we're starting, in this case, with the shadows. Now, if you were shading, say, a piece of white fabric, you're halfway there. The next step, if you're shading white fabric, the next step is to find the values that are not shadow shapes, but slightly mid-tone, half-tone shapes that are usually caused by crinkles in the fabric, slight folds, slight angle changes where the light is hitting the object. And you'll put those in very lightly. So you find those shapes. Go with the fabric very softly. Usually there will be a turn from the shadow into the light. It's usually very delicate. It also comes out of the shadow area. Sometimes you'll see a very, very soft ridge, light. And again, if this were a piece of white fabric, about this point, you could start putting in some very, very purposeful contour lines that determine some of the folds of the fabric. Try to let a lot of the shapes create the contour lines themselves, but if necessary, you can darken them and add contour lines as you did in your contour drawings. Okay, and you could say that, you know, if you were drawing white fabric, there you go. This is how you would handle white fabric. But because this is a piece of dark fabric, we have to take it a step further, and that is we have to establish a middle tone to the overall drawing, because the fabric that I'm drawing happens to be brown. So the value of this brown is darker than a mid-tone. So any of the folds and creases that on a white piece of fabric were done very lightly I have to now darken those a little bit more than I would had I been working with the white fabric, because dark fabric is lower on the value scale than white, obviously, so everything has to be brought down a few shades darker. Also going to establish a little bit of a core shadow along the edge of that fabric. Remember to change directions when you're shading, when possible. Draw the pencil towards you if you can. If you get too dark in an area, take your kneaded eraser, lightly pick up an area that needs to get lighter. And now, once I have these areas set up, I can now go in and start very lightly laying in a middle tone value. I'm going to go very, very gently. Paying attention to any areas that have a very light, where the light is hitting it directly. Got to make sure not to lose any of your shapes. If you notice they are, go back in with your pencil and lightly reinforce the lines that you've created. And once you've determined, or at least gotten, these middle areas lightly established, then you start going back in to your shadow shapes and finding those darkest darks. Now, most of those darkest darks are going to be around areas where the folded fabric is touching another area of fabric that is in shadow, because less light is hitting that. when you're looking at these photos or when you're looking at your actual still life, really get up close, zoom in so that you can actually see the different variations in your shadows. Okay, it's not pitch black. There are variations in there. Remember, the camera always lies. Go back in and reinforce any of the crinkles and not as dark shadow folds created in the fabric, and adjust your values accordingly. You know, always maintain what is dark, what is light, what is in between. At some point you'll start also, well, this point, you can also start picking out areas that have very specific light spots, areas that are peaks and little small divots, I call them, in the fabric that get light. And you treat the contours of the fabric like you treat anything else that you've drawn so far this semester. There are hard edges, there are soft edges. What time are we at on this?
18 minutes.
Oh, that's not bad. You're also going to edit what you're putting into your drawings. You don't have to draw every single little dent, ding, crimp, whatever that you see in the fabric. You can do selective editing. That doesn't mean to eliminate everything and say, oh, well, I just don't want to draw it. But you don't have to draw every single little crease in your fabric, because that will just take an excessively long time. So again, we're working just like I showed you in the first of the rendering videos. You work from general to specific. You work from large, basic shapes into smaller, sharper, specific shapes. Okay. A lot of these ridge shapes that you'll notice, areas that seem lighter than the rest, usually have a very specific area of darkness very close to them. It's where the fabric is tightest. It's where it is at its most extreme position relative to the light. That is, its apex. And so you're going to see a lot of different shapes and shadows forming. Just giving it a little finger blend to give it a unity. And now you would go through it and pull out any of your light areas that you see. If you see any areas that need to be lightened or darkened, you go ahead and do that. Okay, and I'm going to say that this is pretty good. So this again is how I recommend that you go about shading your fabric. Just take it nice and slow and easy. Try not to get carried away with every single little fold in fabric. It'll always be there. As long as you can give the suggestion of the illusion of dimension and weight and form, you should be able to do this without a lot of problem. And of course, if you need any help, go ahead, get a hold of me, and I will do my best to help you out. Okay, there we go. Thanks very much.